Without further ado, Casey, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Sofyan. All right, I am going to share my screen. Is that good?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the organizers and for the invitation. I'm really excited to share with you all today a little bit about my research. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge and honor the Porowa, Tomi, Arawa, and Ojibwe tribes, the original people of the land upon which Northwestern University stands, and the Native people who remain on the land today. Water is an essential substance to support life. It is necessary for both biophysical existence, composing up to 70% of the human body. It also holds symbolic and ideological importance, whether as the primordial sea from which creation emerged, or a blessed material with the ability to cleanse. When discussing water management and politics of water in the context of Western ontologies that consider nature, culture, and material immaterial to be distinct categories, access to these different aspects of water can be missed. When studying political ecology, we interrogate historical, political, and environmental contexts, and I argue that ontological context must be considered as well. Across ancient Maya history in Mesoamerica, rulers exerted power over commoners by both physically controlling access to water and commuting with deities through elaborate rituals to control rainfall. In some city centers, divine rulers failed to provide adequate water during drought, which led commoners to effectively vote with their feet and abandon these cities. In the midst of the resulting socio-political reorganization, which is sometimes problematically referred to as the classic period collapse, the city of Aventura was thriving. And so today, I will be discussing Aventura as a case study for an ontologically oriented political ecology. So here's just to give you an idea of where Aventura is located geographically. And the image to the right is what we refer to as the main temple at Aventura. It's the tallest temple at the site. That just gives you an idea of what it looks like today, sort of overgrown with vegetation. So in this talk, I will start by, I argue that ontologies of landscape contributed to Aventura's continuing occupation during drought by facilitating open access to water resources. I'll start off by defining ontologies and explain exactly what I mean when I say ontologies. In ancient Maya, ontologies considered substances such as water to be an active social force. I'll then provide just a brief overview of ancient Maya water management practices before turning to my case study at Aventura. Geological features known as pocket bajos are central to my discussion. And these features, which are essentially depressions in the land, are today seasonally inundated, yet likely held water year-round in the past. Water and pocket bajos shaped the city both physically in terms of its construction and socially by acting as sites for community building activities. Next, I turn to households. Although there was inequality at Aventura, during my research, I found that commoners and elites alike had access to the equally important biophysical and metaphysical aspects of water. I present data from pedestrian survey and household excavation that indicate both commoners and elite were physically accessing pocket bajo water resources, as well as performing ancestor veneration connected to water's cosmological qualities. I'll conclude on two important points. First, at Aventura, ancient Maya ontologies of landscape allowed water to cut across hierarchical lines of power, contributing to the open access that resulted in Aventura's resilience. Second, the case of Aventura indicates that it is not inevitable for people at the bottom of a hierarchy to have less access to resources. So this invites the possibility that restricting access to resources may not be necessary to cope with scarcity. So I define ontologies as ways of being in the world. So that is, I don't assume that there is one true world out there that people view differently through lenses of culture. Instead, humans and non-humans exist in many life worlds that overlap. So one ontology that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with is a Western binary ontology that separates categories of natural and cultural into dichotomies that oppose one another. And there's a lot of other binaries that are related to this nature-culture divide, and I've listed a few there for you on the slide. The one that's going to be the most relevant for the discussion today is biophysical and metaphysical, but a lot of these are interrelated. But not all ontologies consider natural resources as something out there to be extracted and accumulated. Indigenous thinkers have long been advocating that Western scholars take Indigenous ways of being in the world seriously. In such ontologies, things are not understood in opposition to one another, but rather meaning emerges from the relationships between things. So instead of the world being divided into natural and cultural, humans live within the world on one plane where they engage with all aspects of the environment. As Indigenous feminist geographer Juanita Sundberg puts it, humans, animals, plants, and spirits are beings who participate in the everyday practices that bring the world into being. So in non-capitalist ancient Maya ontologies, there was no hard and fast separation of nature and culture. Society was not just composed of humans. Non-human entities were active in social life. Substances such as water should be taken seriously as political actors that interact with humans and are involved in the creation and enactment of inequalities. So throughout this talk, I will refer to the categories of metaphysical and biophysical to discuss different aspects of water. And I'm not trying to divide these aspects, but instead by prioritizing both kind of on the same level and highlighting the role of non-human substances, my aim is to interrogate the political ecology of Aventura in its ontological context. So the ancient Maya area refers to an area of Mesoamerica that includes southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and northern Honduras. And so this is just a map for you with some sites pointed out. You can see this clustering of sites here in northeastern Guatemala, and that's the Petén region, which is often referred to as the Maya heartland because of the prevalence of large city centers. And here's a breakdown of the three main time periods that archaeologists refer to, the pre-classic, classic, and post-classic. They're pretty arbitrary. They're based off the chronology of Tikal, and they work at some sites and they don't work at other sites, and I'll discuss that in a little bit more. Around 900 CE, many of the large centers in the heartland were depopulated, and this has been referred to as the collapse. It's problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, it erases the millions of Maya people living today, and it also misses the fact that there were a lot of sites that were still occupied during this time period, Aventura being one of them. That being said, this was a time period of socio-political reorganization, and it also coincides with a massive drought that's been documented across the region. So water management is an excellent medium to examine political ecology in ancient Maya society. It's a key resource that's ubiquitous, but it's often difficult to obtain for both geographical and political reasons. Rainfall is highly seasonal across Mesoamerica, and particularly in the northern lowlands, surface water is really scarce. So in the largest Maya city centers, such as Tikal and Petén, were characterized by divine rulership, and ruler's power was entangled with water, both as a physical resource and a cosmologically powerful substance. So here is just an image of some of the reservoirs at Tikal, and you can see they are surrounded by all this massive monumental architecture. And archaeologists have approached ancient Maya water management in these cities through the lens of political economy, focusing on how elites controlled important resources to attain wealth and stability. So even if leaders weren't directly managing water, they were still responsible for providing resources to repair and maintain water systems, as well as performing key water rituals. Water was central to ancient Maya cosmology, as the earthly realm of the cosmos was often portrayed as a crocodile or a turtle submerged in water. And openings in the earth associated with water, such as caves, were often treated as watery entrances to the underworld. So the image on the left is of the opening of Aktun Tunichil Muknal, which is a famous cave in Belize. And then the image to the right is of a recreation of Xibalba, which is the underworld, from a really amazing museum in Chetumal. So cavities in the Earth's surfaces, such as caves, were physical links between human and non-human worlds. So you would enter through the cave to access places such as Xibalba. Divine ancient Maya rulers used symbolism and ritual to control resources in order to legitimize their power. So to assert metaphysical connections to water, divine rulers would engage in actions such as grand public water rituals, and they would do this to demonstrate to commoners that they had access to the supernatural qualities of water. They would also display symbolism related to water on large scales. However, during drought, many commoners lost faith in the divine elite's ability to mediate environmental change. So one of the ways this is evident is increasing ritual pilgrimages to cave sites outside of city centers. So commoners were effectively taking water management into their own hands. Water's intimacy with ideology, ritual, and power makes it a material that's not only key for the biophysical survivals of individuals, but the survival of political and social systems as well. So now, turning to Aventura. Aventura is a medium-sized ancient Maya city, and it's located in what is now the Corozal district of Belize. The city itself is composed of 6 main temple plazas, and the highest temple is 20 meters high. That's that image I showed you at the beginning, and that is located right here on the map. This is the main temple. These are the temple complexes that kind of sneak through the center. And just real quickly for the non-archaeologists, the pink squares labeled as mounds are just the remains of ancient buildings. So the city was occupied as early as the late preclassic period, from 300 BCE to 250 CE, and it saw its first period of large-scale construction during the early classic. The city was at its height of population during what we refer to as the extended terminal classic, which is 750 to 1100 CE. And again, this coincides with and surpasses the period of collapse around 900. The Aventura Archaeology Project is the first large-scale archaeological project to conduct sustained research at the site. It builds upon previous research conducted by Raymond Sidris out of UCLA in 1974. So the Aventura Archaeology Project, which is directed by Cynthia Robin of Northwestern, has been conducting research at Aventura since 2015, with the exception of this year due to COVID-19. And I conducted my dissertation fieldwork over 5 seasons, and that included 2 years of survey and 3 years of excavation. So the Yucatan Peninsula, on which Aventura is located, is essentially a large plateau of karstic limestone, and this limestone forms the bedrock. The karstic qualities of the bedrock make it really prone to cracking and sinking. And the cracking and sinking results in what we refer to as karstic depressions, which are non-draining areas of low elevation. They were and continue to be important resources because they have the potential to provide both water and agricultural land. Additionally, because they often filled with water, some karstic depressions may have had ideological importance as watery entrances to the underworld. So in his original 1974 survey, Sidris identified 3 low-lying areas about a square kilometer in area within Aventura's city center that he designated as bajos. And when archaeologists today talk about bajos, they're referring to these massive karstic depressions that are up to 1,000 square kilometers in area. There's an image of a cross-section of a bajo, just to give you an idea of the geology. So the bajos at Aventura, obviously much smaller, they are more aligned with what we call pocket bajos. Geologically, they're the same, but because they're smaller, they get the kind of cute name of pocket bajos. The landscape within and immediately surrounding Aventura is dominated by pocket bajos. So as you can see from the site map, they're not just restricted to the site core, they're also dispersed throughout the site. And we've mapped 5 so far, but they're across the landscape. They're just kind of go on forever, it seems like. And throughout our survey, we also found that households of all statuses were present along their edges. So when you get out to the outskirts where there's fewer elite households, there are still commoner households along pocket bajo edges. So this is an image. This is taken from the vantage point of standing on top of the main temple, looking south into a pocket bajo. And this is the start of the dry season, so there's still some standing water left in the pocket bajo. Today they're seasonally inundated and they flood during the rainy season, but it's likely that during ancient Maya occupation, they contained standing water year-round. And a large portion of my dissertation research has been centered around reconstructing the ecologies of pocket bajos in order to better understand their role in Aventura's occupation. So oral histories indicate that pocket bajos at Aventura held water year-round as recently as the end of the 19th century, when the historic village of San Jose de los Abanes was founded. So this is a close-up image of one of the pocket bajos that we excavated, and then the image to the right is what we call a profile map. It just shows basically one of the walls of the excavation. The dark layer on top is what we call the humus or the topsoil, and then everything beneath it are stratigraphic layers of sediment. So in this pocket bajo excavation, which was in 2019, we encountered a historic period glass bottle fragment between the interface of two deep stratigraphic layers. And so the red star on this image shows the location of where we encountered that glass bottle fragment. And this dates to the end of the 19th century. The presence of this artifact at the interface of the two deepest layers suggests that the soils deposited on top eroded after the deposition of the historic artifact, so sometime around 1900 CE. And a radiocarbon date was also taken from a stratigraphic layer. It's shown by the location of that black star there. And that radiocarbon date came back to us with a date range of 1684 to 1930 CE. So these multiple lines of evidence corroborate those oral histories and suggest that pocket bajos at Aventura began to fill with sediment during the end of the 19th century. And then they were seasonally inundated by the early 20th century. In ancient Maya, maintenance of karstic depressions for water management, particularly the prevention of erosion, has been documented all across the Maya area. One really interesting thing about pocket bajos is they do not fit neatly into categories of natural and cultural. One excavation I conducted in 2016 on the edge of a pocket bajo, we found the edge was formed by sloping bedrock, irregularly shaped from processes of erosion. You can see in this image here, these really irregular undulations in the limestone bedrock. And then in contrast, in 2018, we found steps that had been carved into the soft limestone bedrock. So these steps in particular were uncovered directly north of the main temple and were likely constructed to facilitate some kind of access to Bajo 2, which is the name of this pocket bajo. The physical material of the limestone bedrock is the same in both instances, but the processes are different, which blurs the boundaries between ecological and anthropogenic. So although the people living at Aventura who constructed the main temple certainly had the means, resources, and technology to undertake grand episodes of construction, they left the overall shape of the pocket bajo intact. And this can be said of all the pocket bajos in the site core. While they all have been constructed on or cut into, their general shape is really irregular. And this stands in contrast to features such as reservoirs, which tend to be either rectangular or circular. So pocket bajos influence how the people of Aventura built their city, both in terms of its spatial layout and its physical construction. So I argue they were active in its creation. On an inter-site scale, Aventura was outside of the purview of divine rulers in the really hierarchically organized regions such as the Patan. Aventura's location has previously been described as peripheral due to its distance from large centers and lack of elite markers such as hieroglyphs and carved monuments. But more recent scholarship has really pushed back against that and argued instead that the Corazal Bay area where Aventura is located was actually a very strategic and beneficial settlement location due to its proximity to both riverine and marine resources. So the Corazal Bay area was connected to the Patan heartland through trade, but it was also politically autonomous. So within the site itself, there was a large degree of inequality. Because archaeologists analyze material culture, we often measure inequality through materials. So one way to measure socioeconomic inequality is through house size. At Aventura, significant diversity in house size suggests there's a great degree of socioeconomic difference. So for example, stone masonry structures are more labor intensive to construct than perishable structures, as the construction material is larger and it needs to be cut into square blocks, which may indicate greater access to resources and labor. And so on the right, there's an image of an elite household that the Aventura Archaeology Project excavated. This top area is what we call the superstructure. So this would have been the living space. This is a nicely preserved floor, and there are 2 benches. And then these are the remains of walls that have since kind of crumbled down. And they, in antiquity, would have supported what's known as a corbel vaulted ceiling. So this would have been much taller and had this stone roof. In contrast, because perishable structures do not preserve in the archaeological record, the remaining mounds, what gets left behind, is much shorter. So this is an image of a pole and thatch house. And you can see beneath the poles, there is a platform there, or a substructure. And so this would have been constructed out of stone. So now today in the archaeological record, this is all we have. We don't have the whole superstructure of the pole and thatch house. So these perishable structures, the remains of them are much shorter than the masonry structures. And so during our survey, we classified households in 3 types, representing commoners, mid-range, and elite based off height differences of structures. During his test program of commoner households at Aventura in 2018, my colleague, Zach Nissen, found that height variation in commoner mounds was largely due to occupational length. So shorter mounds had fewer construction sequences and were constructed more recently than the larger commoner mounds. Higher mounds as a result of accumulative construction indicates higher status, in part because, as Patricia McEnany has argued, architecture expresses the concept of descent through continuous use with modifications of a structure. So that is, larger mounds may be representative of higher status households, not simply because they had access to more resources, but also because they had deeper history of ties to the land. The first household I'll talk about in more detail is the commoner household that I excavated in 2019. During survey, we named this household Group 54, and then the mounds were sequentially numbered based off when we encountered them. So this gives us with really lovely names like Group 54 Mound 5 or G54 Mound 5, M5. And so this is the household group that I excavated up here, G54. These 3 larger structures would have been residential structures centered around a central patio where most of the activities would be taking place. And then these 2 structures here are ancillary structures. And we excavated this one and actually found it was a kitchen. I selected G54M5 to excavate because it was the closest residential structure to the pocket bajo, which is Bajo 4. And I was really interested in the relationship between the living space and the pocket bajo. That image on the left is an orthomosaic compiled from a drone images. And it's just an aerial view of our trench excavation. I know it looks like a pile of rocks, but I'll explain it a little bit more on the next slide. So G54M5 was composed of a terraced platform that supported a substructure that would have supported perishable superstructures in antiquity. The platform had 3 terraced levels, and they are indicated by these green arrows. They trace these lines of stones. So the terraces led down southward. And we also encountered a small step off the lowest level of the terrace. So these physical characteristics of the construction of the platform, along with the spatial relationship to Bajo 4, suggest commoners living here were physically accessing the pocket bajo from the south side of the mound. So that is, the living space was up to the north, and then all of these terraces and the step led down into the pocket bajo. During excavation, we also encountered a secondary burial indicated by the location of the black star on that image. And we define secondary burials as deposits that contain human remains that have been moved from their primary deposition location. So here at this secondary burial, we encountered a smash bowl containing several human teeth. It was not uncommon for people to re-enter burials in ancient Maya society to interact with physical remains of the deceased. Ancient Maya ancestor veneration often incorporated physical remains of the deceased in activities such as incense burning. And this was done to articulate and re-articulate social ties. Engaging with body parts of deceased family members linked present generations to past ones. And as Susan Gillespie has argued, primary and secondary mortuary rituals transformed the dead into ancestral spirits, who are then mediators between living human beings and powerful cosmic forces. So this secondary burial may indicate ancestor veneration that incorporated physical remains of household members, effectively turning them into ancestors in order to access non-human realms. And the act of ancestor veneration did significant social work, forming social memory as a means to forge identities and relationships. Interestingly, this secondary burial was encountered between the living space and the pocket bajo. So the spatial relationship may indicate a connection between the ancestor veneration and Bajo 4, which would suggest commoners living at G54 were accessing the community building qualities of the pocket bajo. So now I will turn to the elite example. The elite household that I excavated was called Group 22, and it was located in the site core directly across the pocket bajo that abuts the main temple. And standing over 3 meters high, it was one of the highest residential mounds that we encountered during survey. The image to the right is an orthomosaic of our excavations. The top here is the superstructure. There's a nicely preserved floor and then walls that went all the way around the superstructure. And then this was the platform and substructure that led down into the pocket bajo, which was Bajo 2. So the room in the superstructure had a single doorway that faced west directly toward Bajo 2. And in the front of the structure, there was a stairway that led down into the pocket bajo. The edge of this pocket bajo is like literally right here at the edge of this image. So this particular household was less than 10 meters away from 2 smaller mounds that were occupied at the same time. But instead of facing them, it was oriented to face the pocket bajo. Additionally, the staircase that led down would have facilitated physical movement between the dwelling and the pocket bajo. So this construction indicates that people living here were able to access the materials, that is water, contained in Bajo 2. And similar to the commoner example, elites at Group 22 were performing household ancestor veneration in between their living space and the pocket bajo. We encountered a cut in Saskab, which is essentially eroded limestone, and then found a single side of an adult pelvis in the cut in the Saskab. So we designated this as a secondary burial because we didn't encounter any other bones in the cut, particularly femurs, which tend to have the best preservation due to their robusticity. So basically, it's likely that this side of the pelvis had been removed from its primary location and placed in the cut, perhaps as part of an ancestor veneration practice. And then directly on top of the cut, we found evidence of a burning event, which may be indicative of incense burning, again, related to ancestor veneration. The spatial relationship between this secondary burial and the pocket bajo suggests that the ancestor veneration was associated with the pocket bajo. So as with the commoner household, people here were creating ancestors in between their dwelling and a pocket bajo, forging social relationships in association with the geological feature. So as I described before, accessing the metaphysical qualities of water in the pocket bajo. Now, of course, the pocket bajos in these two different contexts may not have been equal. Bajo 2 by the elite household was located directly next to the main temple. So for example, it may have had more metaphysical importance than Bajo 4. Additionally, we don't know the quality of water in each of the pocket bajo. I'm currently doing some microbotanical analysis to hopefully get more detailed reconstruction of the ecologies of the pocket bajos. So hopefully we'll know more about that soon. And then finally, there may have been unequal access within households, particularly along lines of differences such as age and gender. I think these are all really interesting and important lines of inquiry, hopefully for future research. So to conclude, ontologies of landscape at Aventura allowed pocket bajos to cut across hierarchical lines of power. Ancient Maya people's ontologies of landscape at Aventura did not divide the world into strict natural and cultural binaries. Ways of being at Aventura considered pocket bajos to be social actors. And people were infinitely entangled with the environment, and society consisted of humans and non-humans, such as plants, animals, earth, and water. Of course, pocket bajos were not total equalizers, and inequality still existed in the city at varying scales. The case of Aventura indicates that it is not inevitable for people at the bottom of a hierarchy to have less access to certain resources. And this, I would argue, invites the possibility that restricting access to resources may not be necessary to cope with scarcity. Power was not derived from restricting access to water here, even in times of drought. The set of power relationships that structured water management at Aventura does not sit easily with a Western capitalist ontology, where resource accumulation for control and power is commonplace. In the case of Aventura, a household's ability to access water, regardless of socioeconomic status, may have mitigated the effects of socio-political and ecological uncertainty. So despite socioeconomic inequality, commoners and elites alike had access to the equally important biophysical and metaphysical qualities of water in times of scarcity. So considering these different aspects of water results in a political ecology that takes ontological context into account, which I think is a really important consideration in political ecology research. So I'll just conclude by saying thank you. I always joke that archaeology is a team sport, but it's true. There's so many people I wish I could thank, but I particularly want to mention just the communities of the Corazal Bay area that we work with, and all our colleagues down in Belize, as well as my fellow Northwestern graduate students who have been just super supportive throughout the whole dissertation project. So thank you.
Really great. Thank you, Casey, for this really interesting presentations. Now we enter the Q&A sessions, and we have already Sophie as our first. Can you say your questions to Casey, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sofian. Thanks, Casey, for this really great talk. I'm wondering if there's anything specific about, or that you know of specific about the ecology at Aventura that made water availability higher than at other Maya sites, and therefore maybe made this sort of more equitable access possible at this site in a way that it maybe wasn't at others, or if it like seems to be the same ecology at other sites and just this place had more access to water. Thanks.
No, thank you for that question. That's a really great question. So I think it really, it depends on what other sites you're talking about, just because the ecology is really variable across Mesoamerica. One thing that's really advantageous about Aventura's location is it's really close to a river, which a lot of sites, particularly in Petén, don't have the same amount of access to rivers. And so the pocket bajos nowadays flood when the river nearby floods. So I do think that ecology was really beneficial. Of course, there's other examples of cities that are close to rivers that have more like hierarchical control of water. So I don't think that was the only thing, but I definitely think that the presence of these geological features just really throughout the city was definitely contributed to more people just having the opportunity to access them.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. And we have Dika.
Hi, Casey. How are you?
Thank you. Good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating work. As I said previously in our awesome writing group, I'm a big fan of your research, and now being able to see the visualizations of what you're doing, I think that's augmented the significance of your project, and I just admire how much work you put into these dissertations. I have two follow-up questions. The first thing is, I'm just wondering if power-wise, when we talk about power in this society, in this community, whether the access to water as a religious instrument is actually more important resource than having a power over distributing water for household use. The reasons I'm asking that is because if we would like to compare the access to water in terms of religious proposed and household works and household proposed, maybe by knowing which one is more important to accumulate power in that social structure will also lead you to other interesting conclusions about the relationship between inequality, justice, and the structure of the society itself within that community. And my second question also related to that first questions. I'm just wondering if you can highlight even more the contributions on what do we learn about justice and inequality looking at this relationship between this community and water, between the Bajo and the Pocket Bajos, and how access to water is kind of like dispersed around social strata in that community. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Dika. Those are both excellent questions. So to your first point about whether maybe the metaphysical was more important than the biophysical, if I'm understanding your question, that's a really interesting point. And I'm trying to think how you could measure that in like the archaeological record. And I think doing the more detailed ecological analysis and then maybe having a broader sample size of different pocket bajos that may have more like public ritual areas nearby them versus like smaller household areas. I think maybe if you did those kind of analyses, you could tease that out a little bit. I will say I'm really trying to hold these biophysical and metaphysical aspects kind of as equal, more in an effort to not divide them so much, if that makes sense. And I think that's part of the kind of the ontological orientation that I'm trying to consider. But I do think that is a really interesting question. And then the second one about justice and inequality, thank you for asking that. I know this is something we've talked about. I really do think that this work can contribute to some environmental justice conversations. I think a lot of what we're seeing is are sort of these narratives that it's natural for marginalized people to live in like, you know, less resource-rich places. And I think that that is not true. And I think that this is kind of an example that pushes back against that, saying that it doesn't have to be that way, that there's other like historical and political and social things that have kind of made it that way. So I kind of see archaeology as being able to provide these counterexamples and hopefully kind of imagine and maybe one day enact a more kind of just society. So I don't know if that's really an answer, but.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. And then we have Mary. Thank you, Mary. Please. Mary, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, so sorry. Oh, here I am.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't want to crowd into your graduate student space, but since there weren't a lot of questions, I thought I would just wanted to say to Casey, what a lovely presentation I thought this was. It's so clear and well organized, and it really ties together the big theoretical questions with your research. You did a great job of making archaeological data sort of legible to a general audience. So, you know, congratulations. I just think that's so amazing. Yeah, it's the makings of a great job talk for sure. I really love so many of the points that you made. I love the idea of the ancestors as intermediaries between the living human community and these kind of non-human powers that be. I think that's fantastic. And I really support your desire to resist the search for hierarchy, which has been one of those go-to things, just like nature culture, where archaeologists coming in from our histories and our backgrounds just look for something that might not be there. So I love the idea of not looking for it until it's there. So I thought those were fantastic. I wanted to say, just as a suggestion, that and you know, Zach knows I'm obsessed with this. I just made the same suggestion to him, but Severin Fowles' Archaeology of Doings book, which, you know, is about the Southwest. He has such a clear statement about pushing back against the separation of ritual that's metaphysical from you know, everyday agricultural work that's practical. He just insists that that's not an indigenous way of looking at things, and that doing a ritual could seem just as much kind of pragmatic and everyday as doing something else. So I think it's a nice source to quote. So that's my suggestion. Great talk. I really loved it. I did have one just sort of very mundane question, which is, I love the idea of a house that directly opens up to the water that way. But is it more unpleasant? Like, I would just think it would be like sweaty and buggy, and often you see people instead like putting their houses on higher areas, even like building mounds to do that, and then just letting the farm area be low. So I just wondered what it's physically like to be working in those spaces. I mean, doing your excavations, you must have a sense of what it feels like physically.
Yeah, no, that first of all, thank you so much. I appreciate all of your kind words, and I really like Severin Fowles' work, so I would definitely pull quotes from him. Yeah, so actually that the stairway leading into the pocket bow was really interesting, and when we first kind of encountered it, we thought there had to be another door on the other side, because why would people want to walk right into the water? And so we ended up clearing just the top of the whole wall of that superstructure to see if there was a door on the other side, and there wasn't. We were like kind of surprised by that, but I also thought it was really interesting. One of the things that I really want to get at with the microbotanical analysis is kind of figuring out, just beyond how much water was in there, what the other kind of ecologies were like, and what, you know, what plants were in there. Were people using these spaces for fishing? Today they use them for fishing when they flood. So it's possible that there were kind of other, I don't know, we don't really know what kind of activities were happening right on the edge, unfortunately. But yeah, it's an interesting thing that I guess I haven't really figured out yet why it goes straight into the water, but
I mean, it seems like it would be so easy to do sort of morning and evening ablutions, you know, like a little bit of bathing ritual, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Just for cooking and stuff, it's so practical.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And the platform does extend south to a decent degree. So there was like an activity area that was a little removed from the actual edge. So yeah, but yeah, it's interesting.
All right. Next we have Zach.
Hi, Casey. This is such a great talk. I've loved watching this develop. And I was actually just going to build on Mary's, because I was also thinking about Sev Fowles' book while you were giving this talk, especially around the orientation question. I think that I'm just interested in if you have any more thoughts or want to talk more about the significance of this orientation towards the Bajo, because across the Maya area, settlement studies have really focused on the orientations of buildings. And one thing that you started to find in my excavations of commoner households, I'm finding a similar pattern of houses being consistently oriented more towards the pocket bajos than other buildings, where for non-Mayanists in the room, archaeologists often look at households across the Maya area, and there are common sets of patterns, basically. And one of the most common patterns is a plazuela group, which is just basically a U shape where you get 3 buildings, one on each side, and they're all facing towards one another. And then you get this little activity area in the center. And for some reason at Aventura, that's not a very common pattern we're finding. We're seeing it in some places, but really just in the biggest houses. But the most common pattern is actually houses being faced towards the pocket bajos and separated from one another, not closely linked to one another. They're separated and they're facing. And I think it does, like, you're raising really great points about the significance of both this sort of functional components of the pocket bajos, but also the ritual significance at the same time. And I think that might like shed some light on that and give some insights as to like what is going on in people's daily lives that is so important that they orient their houses in particular ways. Instead of being oriented towards other people, it's oriented towards these environmental features. And sorry, I'm providing answer for you because I think it's so great. so interesting, and something that I haven't seen at other sites before. And it's been so interesting to see this sort of play out at Aventura.
Yeah, no, thank you, Zach. Actually, as you were talking, I was kind of, I don't know why I haven't made this connection before, but I feel like that's like another line of evidence for just how active the landscape was and how like pocket bajos in particular are really active in like society and, you know, daily life and the way the city was built. And I think, yeah, I guess it's another line of evidence for that argument also.
And even you showed the G48 excavations earlier on in the talk.
Mm-hmm.
And that is it's a group located in the site core. And that building is still facing the pocket bajos outside. It's not facing the monumental building. Well, actually, it's got 2 faces. So the people that built that building decided to face it towards the water, but also towards these monumental buildings, and in almost sort of making them equal, right? And I think that's so interesting. And then you get houses like the commoner houses we've excavated where they're just facing the water. They're not facing other buildings. But yeah, this is great.
When are we going to co-author a paper, Zach? It needs to happen.
Okay, great. Yeah. Next we have Emily.
Hi, Casey. Sorry, I'm going to keep my camera off. That's okay. My internet's kind of spotty. But thank you for this presentation. It was really interesting. I love hearing about your research. I was just wondering, and if you don't have any answer to this, that's completely fine. We can talk more about it later too if you want to. But I was wondering, because you talked about how there was like a river nearby, so there's these different like forms of waterways or in water. And I was wondering if you'd seen any archaeological evidence for different kinds of relationships with water in the different forms it takes on the landscape.
Oh, that's a really cool question, Emily. Thank you for asking that. So my original plan was to actually do a big survey in between the site and the river. And then we tried to do it and it was like impassable, partly because of the mangroves. But we actually recently, I probably can't like talk too much about the details, but we did get LiDAR data recently that shows potential other kind of water management features that are happening in between the river and the site. So there's I think there's definitely different water management practices that are also water used for different reasons. Like some of these are pretty obviously agricultural. I also wouldn't be surprised if like today, there are waterways that go through the mangroves that people use to access like fishing areas in the river. So I wouldn't be surprised if people living in Aventura were doing that as well. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of potential to explore the different types of water and different types of water features and different uses for water. That is definitely something I would like to do in the future. And yeah, let's talk about it more.
We can talk.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Casey.
Okay. Can we talk that in our reading group too? All right. We have Kellen, please.
Okay, thanks so much, Casey. That was a great talk. It was really fun to see how your work's come along since we started together years ago. So I'm going to take it down to the base level because, you know, this isn't my area of expertise or by a long shot. I'm thinking by all these questions, how did maybe people in Aventura, but maybe also people elsewhere in the region deal with sewage and deal with human waste? Because we're talking about bodies being deposed. We're talking about, you know, ablutions and sort of religious practices, metaphysical, but there's also, you know, and rightly so, maybe those aren't so different in some cases, but I'm wondering how that might have played out in these bajos. Are they waste areas or are they clean areas, or how was there some type of plumbing or, you know, like aqueducts, or I don't know, maybe if it's unrelated, that's okay, but maybe you can just tell me about that a little bit.
No, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. So there wasn't any kind of plumbing or anything like that. I will be the first to admit I don't know a lot about this topic in my area, but I know that there are some hypotheses that people were using human waste for like fertilizer, in which case, yeah, I guess I would be kind of surprised if people were putting certain kinds of waste in the pocket bajos because they're so close to their house, but I guess I don't actually know that. I do know that people weren't, at least where I excavated, weren't throwing their trash in there. We found middens, which are just like trash deposits that were always like uphill away from the pocket bajos. They weren't, like sometimes we usually expect to see them on the back of the building, but we wouldn't find them like right off the back of the building if it was near a pocket bajo. We'd find them like on the other side from where we were expecting them, uphill away from the pocket bajo. So we know they weren't throwing like their trash, at least where I looked. But that's an interesting question. I guess I'm not really sure. I don't know a lot about that topic.
And who knows, like you mentioned something and maybe it pertains to a totally different type of analysis, but you mentioned like analyzing the sediments or things in the bajos. Maybe not all bajos are equal. You know, not that I want to push against your kind of awesome vision, just kind of different ways of thinking about it maybe. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, and that's something that I have been actually thinking about a lot, that probably not all the bajos were equal, probably not all used for the same things. Even one pocket bajo was probably used by different people differently. There's probably a lot of differences. So I think that's all kind of like, hopefully future research I'll be able to do. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kellen. We still have a couple of minutes for Q&A. If there's any questions, please just unmute yourself and then ask the questions. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in if you don't mind. Right. Hi, Casey. I really liked your presentation. That was like really evocative of just like the other ways of being. It's really inspiring. And I wanted to learn more about the configuration of just kind of like, I guess I just wanted to be transported to the place a little bit more. And I was thinking about, it sounds like what you're saying is you expect all soil within these bajos to have been stripped away. So it's just these bedrock modifications with the water at the bottom. So I was wondering if you could comment on that interpretation of mine, if it's right. And also thinking about the human remains that you found and like whether, like how they were they covered with like a layer of plaster, like were they protected anyway, or like do you have a sense of how people would have moved around them? Would they been off to the side, and that kind of just more of the kind of phenomenology of the bajo?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, the question of if they were clearing all the sediment out and just leaving it as kind of a bedrock feature containing water, that's kind of where my lines of evidence that I have so far are pointing to, although I would be kind of surprised if they were left as these like completely pristine, cleared places with no other ecology, like with like animals or plants growing in them. So I think that my like dream is to be able to completely reconstruct the ecology and then like have some really cool drawing of all the different plants and animals that were in pocket bajos and like how people were using them. But I guess I don't want to have a cop out, but I guess I don't really have all that data to do that yet. And then in terms of the location of the human remains, that's an interesting question, particularly in the commoner household. I excavated where I excavated because I didn't want to encounter any human remains. I was like off on the corner a little bit instead of in the center. And so the secondary burial that we encountered there was in between layers of fill. So that one wasn't completely plastered over, but it was built over. And it was off of the corner of the living area. So I think it would have been probably easy to avoid just by its spatial location. And then in the elite context, it wasn't plastered over, but it was filled in with sediment, the cut. It was just filled in with like different layers of sediment that had been like compacted down. But that was like right on the edge of the pocket bajo. So I don't know if people were like actually walking there or what was going on there in terms of like physical movement around the remains, but yeah, no, those are very interesting questions. I always wish I had more pictures, but pocket bajos are really hard to photograph. So thank you for asking about the phenomenology. I'll think on that a little bit more.
Thank you.
All right, I think that wraps our meeting today. It's been really great talk, really great, flow of discussions. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Kacey, for joining us today, and thank you for all the participants. We really hope that you guys also join us for our next presenter next month. We will talk about the plantations, feminist ecology, and then care in Indonesia. I hope that's interests you. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.